Thank you so much, Mickey and Heath, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm Yiyang Li. The title of my talk is thinking about how we can charge and discharge lithium-ion batteries just one particle at a time. And so this is one of the first romance projects in the battery section. So I first want to introduce our team. So on the academic side, it's by myself, Professor Robert Houghton, and Professor Katsuyo Thornton, who are here in the audience. And on industry side, we have 5 industry partners, Mercedes-Benz with Tobias, LG Energy Solution, Borg Warner, Thermo Fisher, and Voltaic. So the critical component technology we're studying is the lithium-ion battery. And to give an introduction to the lithium-ion battery, which is used to power, to supply energy to the electric vehicle, we see here is we have 2 key components. So if we look inside, it has an anode, which is usually graphite, and a cathode, which is a lithium metal oxide. When a battery is discharging, lithium goes from the anode material to the cathode material. This changes the energy of the chemical bonds, but rather than releasing the energy as heat, this gets released as electrical energy, which is used to power the drivetrain and the power electronics. The goal of our research to understand some of the fundamental processes that underlie the charge and discharge of battery materials. It's very exciting because some of my colleagues say that industry doesn't care about fundamental research, but clearly this is not the case, as I'll show in this talk. So if we look inside of the lithium-ion battery, what we see is that both electrodes are made up of a porous agglomerate, an ensemble of micron-sized particles. So you look very closely inside, we notice that the cathode is comprised of these about 1 billion of these micron-sized particles in each battery cell, and the anode is similar, just a little bit harder to see. When we charge the battery, we take the average behavior of all this ensemble of particles. So we get something that looks like this. Basically, we get charging where the voltage increasing, and discharging where the voltage decreases over time, and this allows us to store energy and release energy on demand. The question that we'd be interested in is to understand charging and discharging on a single particle. So how do we understand this process, the most fundamental process of a battery, but understand it in these fundamental building blocks, which are these micro-sized particles which can store and release energy? So one way to do this would be to use microscopy. So I want to present some beautiful work done by my colleague, Professor Neil Dasgupta, a couple years ago, imaging this graphite electrode. So as he charges this graphite, notice that the color changes from black to orange and eventually to red, maybe, or black to red to orange. So this is one way that we can use to probe the individual particles. The challenge of this approach is twofold. First, the color change, in my opinion, is usually a qualitative metric. It doesn't tell you exactly what the state of charge is. It gives you an approximation. And not all materials show color change. So in graphite, it does, but in some of our cathode materials on the other side, there's very little or if any color change in those materials. So instead, the approach we settled on is to use what are called microelectrode arrays. So this is a field that was predominantly used in neuroscience. So this is some work done by my colleagues at Yusik Yoon in electrical engineering and Tim Bruns in the medical school. So in the clean room, they used the clean room to fabricate what are called microelectrodes, which are very small electrodes. And then they put neurons, in this case, they put or cells, in this case, they put a bacteria called ganglia on this microelectrode, and they use it to measure the action potential of these neurons to understand how the neurons interact with one another. So this is a very standard technique in the field of neuroscience. What we come at is, can we also use this technique for batteries? Batteries are also electrochemical. They're also about 10 microns in size. Can we use this platform to charge or discharge individual batteries without having to use optical microscopy? So this is work done by PhD student Junho Min. He's a 4th-year student now. And what he did is he fabricated using this microelectrode. So this is about 2 centimeters here. And what he can do is he can put these individual particles onto these microfabricated electrodes. So the electrodes are about the size of the individual particles, and then he can contact it using these electrodes or these electrodes at the corner, these very much larger electrodes here. And so here we can see some images of particles placed on the microelectrode. If you want to see his poster, it's actually number 1 over there. So people often ask, how do we do this? It sounds like very tedious. Maybe it is tedious, I don't know, I've never done it myself. But my students are able to do this very well. So you can see this image. So we have a needle mounted on a micromanipulator, and is able to move the particle manipulated using this needle. So you can see this is not sped up, it only takes less than a minute to assemble each particle. It's done by Wangjun Suk, also in the back. So here is what happens when we do electrochemistry, when we charge and discharge these single particles. So on the left, we see our charging profile. So on the x-axis, we have the capacity in picoamp hours. So this contrasts with amp hours for real battery cells, so about 1 billion times smaller. Y-axis, we have our voltage, and it roughly looks pretty similar to what we expect from a battery cell that we see on the right. So you can see the voltage is essentially the same. The charge and discharge profile, the shape of it looks roughly the same, with the exception of what happens at the very beginning, which will become significant as we show later on. What else we can do is we can also look at these particles before and after cycling. So this is work done by a first-year PhD student, Malalini Krishna, under the supervision of my colleague Robert Hovden. So you can look at the pristine particle on the SCM here. Then you looked at what happens after 2 cycles, and you can see that these particles have cracked substantially within these particles. So because the electrolyte is a liquid, we can infer that probably the liquid can go infiltrate into these cracks. So very recently, they've done some TEM, transmission electron microscopy, here at the MC², where we looked at the individual atoms in these battery material. And what it sees is down here, we see the arrangement. They call this a layer structure because there are these transitional metal and lithium layers. But at the surface, near the cracks, they can see a change into a very different crystal structure. We call this a rock salt. It's a cubic structure. And this is a classic fingerprint for what happens when a battery particle is exposed to the liquid electrolyte. So this tells us that even though these cracks are very small, it's clear that the particles are being exposed to the liquid electrolyte up top. So what we found here is that typically we imagine that the battery particles are monolithic. Basically, you get lithium diffusion from the outside to the inside. But instead, what we find is that the liquid penetrates these battery particles. As a result, it goes to the inside of the particle. So you can think about these cracks as forming a highway so that the lithium doesn't become stuck like the previous speaker was in traffic. Instead, because the lithium is able to go through it, it enables these battery particles to charge and discharge much faster because of the electrolyte penetration. So our final collaborator, academic collaborator, is Professor Katsuyo Thornton and her student Imana Maria, who I believe has a poster over there as well. And so they did some simulations, basically seeing what happens when you go from 1 big particle into 10 small particles. And what they've shown is that if you go from 1 big particle, the charging profile here, the voltage is much higher, meaning you're paying a much higher energy cost if you have 1 big particles before cracking as opposed to 10 smaller particles after cracking. And so what we think is happening is that it cracks at the very beginning, going from this 1 particle regime into the 10 smaller particle regime, and we see this hump, as we've seen here, on individual particles, very similar to the hump that we see in a real battery. You can see this magnitude is larger because we think it doesn't crack to 10 particles. It actually probably cracks to more like 100 or 1,000 smaller particles. And so this qualitatively is able to reproduce this voltage profile that I say is very significant. So why does this matter for industry? So normally when we think about cracks, it's something that we want to avoid. So I'm on an airplane, and if I see the wings are cracked, I probably want to get off the airplane as soon as possible. So this heuristic has been adopted by some in the battery field, in which they propose that can we get rid of cracks by using these single crystalline materials rather than this agglomerate of polycrystalline where they sort of run into each other. And the proposal is that a single crystal can have much longer cycle life. Some people say that a single crystal can run 20,000 cycles, which is equivalent, or 30,000 cycles, which is equivalent to a car that's able to go 1 million miles before degrading. What we found is that eliminating cracks will probably make cycle life better, but will preclude the battery from fast charge and discharge. So this is some of our work that we've shown here that shows that polycrystalline particles can be cycled much faster than the single crystalline particles because of these cracks. Unfortunately, this was kind of not very well known in industry previously in the past. So a couple years ago, Tesla was trying to make these single crystalline materials that can, in principle, last a long time. They call these the million-mile batteries. And you can see in 2019, Tesla promised that they will come up with a battery cell that lasts 1 million miles by the year 2020. So it's 2025 right now, and so my understanding is they probably made a cell that lasts 1 million miles, but then they found that it's no longer able to supercharge. So there's no market for a car that cannot supercharge when it's stuck on the side of the road. So it can last 1 million miles, but you won't be able to charge it if you're stuck. So I want to thank our collaborators here. Thanks for the project. The other two projects, I didn't introduce the other two pilot projects. They're led by Professor Neil Dasgupta on solid-state battery manufacturing and Professor Nick Kotov on dry electrode processing in the field of batteries. Thank you all for your attention.